Good evening, gospel revolutionaries around the world. This is Michael Lilborn Williams coming to you this evening from the bonus room above my sister's garage in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate that. We've been in a study that I did not intend to do of the book of Galatians. I don't think we started in chapter 1 on this particular one. But gosh, we've gone through the book of Galatians in this ministry more times than I can count. And it looks like we're going to be going through it many more times because every time it just becomes more and more enlivened. The more we learned about the relationship that is recorded here in the Bible, in the book of Acts and the book of Galatians, in Corinthians and all the way through Paul's writings, and also Peter, James, and John, their relationship, and it not being what we've been told all of these years, that these guys agreed. The fact is, they found little to agree on except that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that was about it. And that's about an agreement that you can get pretty much across the board with all 45,000 denominations around the world. And the reason there are 45,000 denominations around the world is because everybody thinks that these guys didn't disagree. So people will find something in James, they'll find something in John, something in Paul's writings, and they will try to mix them together or forget what Paul said or forget what Peter, James, and John said. We don't do any of that. We want you to know what Peter, James, and John said. And we want you to know what Paul said, and we want you to know we're absolutely convinced Paul was right, and we're absolutely convinced, as Paul was, that Peter, James, and John were dead wrong. Yeah, you heard it right. That's why we call this a gospel revolution. Because the power of the gospel is in Paul's teaching so vividly. It's amazing. But when you begin to try to shoehorn in the teachings of Peter, James, and John, James teaching that you got to keep the law to be able to have faith at all, and John teaching that every time you sin, you got to confess it over and over and over again, that sin's still alive, and Peter talking about a judgment day that's coming. And Paul said that these are the three ways you can fall from grace or insult God's grace. Go around teaching that sin is still alive, teach people they are still under the law, and teach people that God is still angry. That's the three ways Paul said that you offend God's grace. That's the only way you can do it. So by learning these things in the gospel revolution, in my own life and in the lives of the people who have make the effort to bring this little video to you tonight, because there's a whole lot of people involved in this, even though it's just myself sitting here in the office chair, here in my sister's room upstairs. But there's a whole lot that goes into this, and we appreciate what all of you do and have done. And as we go into this in Galatians, I want to recap. You know, I'm a very notorious person for recapping. I like for us to see where we've been to make sure that where we're going is correct. Let's start first with Galatians chapter 1. We found out in Galatians chapter 1, Paul warned about another gospel. Now, the funny thing is that all 45,000 denominations, denomination number 4,000 warns about the other 3,999, and then the other 500 on the other side of it, that's the other gospel. And every single one of them, you can stop and say, they all say that others, and all others are another gospel. But I'm here to tell you they're all wrong. Now, why did I say they're all wrong? Because if there was any of them right, we'd all come to realize that there would only be one gospel. But you see, it's fractured. It's all over the place. But the thing that is not fractured is the gospel, and in particular the gospel that Paul preached and taught and loved and gave himself for completely. He taught this doctrine to Apollos. Apollos gave us the book of Hebrews. Oh my gosh, what a rich finding that has been. But Paul warned, he says, you've been pulled away to another gospel. Now, you can't take away from this writer his definition of what another gospel is. He not only said you've gone with another gospel, I can tell you who's preaching it to you. So in chapter 2, he tells us who has been preaching this other gospel. He said it's Peter, James, and John. He rebuked Peter to the face for what he had brought to the table coming from Peter and James also. James was really the ringleader of this, which is very strange, since James was never called, he was never anointed, he was never a follower of Christ during the days that Jesus taught. James was the physical brother of Jesus Christ, according to just the text, and according to history also. But this man became the head of the church, superseding Peter and John all together, all of the disciples. This man took charge, and he made it very clear that he was in charge. History tells us that once he took charge there in the temple at Jerusalem, he never left Jerusalem one single time on a mission trip or anything else. He was more interested in keeping power than he was in sharing the gospel. Thus, we got just one little letter from him also. And it's making sure you're still under the law. That's what that book is all about. Now, so there was another gospel. We know, according to chapter 2, according to Paul's account, who was preaching that other gospel. But he's also said that this other gospel was being preached by Peter, James, and John and some other Jews, and that Barnabas himself, Paul's own cohort. You think that this legalism is not powerful? You think that legalism doesn't have a suction action that can draw you in and you would be totally duped by it? Not knowing that you had been duped and think that you are living your life for God, when everything that we're doing based on the motive is actually an insult to God. We're offending God's grace. Is that really possible? According to Paul, it is. Not only is it possible, that's how Paul said that the early church got its start. He was hoping for a win here. He was hoping to pull the people back on course. But we know from history, Paul failed. Paul failed to pull this back out of the ditch, even though Jesus had appeared to him on the road to Damascus and took him in the desert. Yeah, Peter, James, and John and the disciples got their 3 years with Jesus, but Paul got his 3 years with Jesus after the resurrection. That's pretty good information Paul's getting there. Now, there's even a group online that deny Paul. They speak about Paul the way I speak about Peter, James, and John. But I congratulate them because they at least see there's a difference. They're just good old legalists and they want to stay legalists, so damn that Paul. So they are out there. I got to read up some of their work and they explain all the reasons why Paul is a bastard apostle, is what they call him. But James is the one who never claims to even have a calling whatsoever. James is the one who mocked Jesus when he was teaching. James is the one who took over. James is the one who intimidated Peter to the point that he denied that Christ had revealed to him that all the Gentiles had been brought in and been made righteous. And Jesus revealed that to him in a vision. And he completely reneged on what Jesus had taught him. Now, you talk about a powerful dude that can get you to deny who Christ is and what he has revealed to you. That's a strong dude. Now, that's strong dude because he stuck with God's law instead of going with God's grace. There was power there to be had, and he seized upon it. That's what's there. Read it. Read Acts 15, read Acts 20, Acts 21, and read the accounts where that they brought Paul in and challenged him on his doctrine. You'll see it was exactly over these situations about the law. So we find that out about who was responsible for this. Then we find out in Galatians chapter 3 that God's faith fulfilled God's law. God's faith fulfilled God's law. God's law led us up to faith, and then faith and grace took over and abandoned the law. It wasn't the junction of where grace and law kissed and said, let's make a religion. No, that's not what happened, folks. The law of God and all prophecy led to a completed work on the cross at Calvary, which has been insulted by Christianity now for 2,000 years. I'm not going to insult Christ anymore with those doctrines that say there's something you have to do, something you haven't done. There's something Jesus failed to do, that everything's incomplete. We're just hanging in limbo for 2,000 years. We are not hanging in limbo. We live in the finished work of the cross. Finished, F-I-N-I-S-H-E-D. I think it's still spelled. Work of the cross. There's nothing else that needs to be done. That's called finished. You know, my brother is helping us out here, and he is pressure washing around the house. He did all the driveway. He's worked like a madman, he and his wife both. And he knows what a finished job is. And when it's finished, it'll be finished, because he is not going to stay away until it's done. He is determined that all of this is going to be done. And that's just my brother. He believes in a finished work himself, and he's going to get his job done. Jesus got his done. And then we find that out in chapter 3, chapter 4. We found out that the reason that the Galatians had been brought back into this position of bondage, my goodness, folks, I'm still just shattered by the statement that we read in the last chapter about how that the disciples, Peter, James, and John, their teachings had completely eroded the image of Christ out of the people of Galatia. The teachings of Peter, James, and John had completely eroded the image of Christ out of the people. And Paul said, I've got to put effort into this to get the image of Christ back to you guys again. You've lost the image of Christ. You're focused on law. You focus on something, that's the image that you have inside of you. We need to focus on Christ and Christ alone, not all of these other things that have been placed out here, telling us judgment's coming, sin's alive and well, and that righteousness is something you got to strive for, and that God's law is still here. God's law was fulfilled by God. God's law was fulfilled by God in Christ. It is done. It's the old covenant. It's not something that is on us. And you're not going to find a preacher in America that's going to agree with that. And if they do, they're going to say yes, if, and, but, or maybe. There are no ifs, there are no ands, there are no buts to the gospel. It's pure gospel. It is pure gospel. And Paul has given us his opinions here. And now we've got down to chapter 5. And here's what he says in chapter 5, after us going through this marvelous teaching and him telling us who the culprits are here, folks. You see, you've got to read it in context and hold that context in your mind, because you'll lose it, because religion just wipes it out for us. But we're not going to allow that to happen. Chapter 5, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Now, I'll guarantee you also this. The yoke of bondage in the vast majority of all churches around the world is sex, drugs, rock and roll. That's, oh man, you smoking, you're in bondage. Well, you definitely are doing something that is not good for you, but it is not biblical gospel bondage that Paul was referring to. No other action, no other deed is bondage. Oh, well, he likes sex, or he's addicted to food. He's in bondage. He's in bondage. I understand that, but you got to understand that's not biblical bondage. That's not this. The writer here is the one talks about bondage. So let's accept what the writer says that bondage is. Now stand fast. Now if you're going to stand fast, Paul knew there was a force moving against these people. You know what that force was? That force was the doctrines of Peter, James, and John. You going to stand fast against something? Let me tell you what you're going to have to stand fast against. The doctrines of Peter, James, and John. You'll lose the image of Christ out of you if you yield to the doctrines of being under the law, that sin is still alive and well, or that judgment is coming to this planet. You will lose the image of Christ if you listen. If you absorb what they say. I teach Peter, James, and John in context, and we can show you exactly what they taught, and we don't try to take it out of context, and we just like we do Paul, we're not going to lace and season Peter, James, and John's teachings with Paul's. We'll let Paul speak for Paul, and we're not going to lace Paul's teachings with Peter, James, and John and try to mix it all up in a bowl and make another new religion, because that's what happens all the time. It's happened 45,000 times now. And that's just in Christianity alone. Yes, I'm wound up again, but you guys are used to that by now. Stand fast, folks. You're going to have to resist a force that was placed on this earth by Peter, James, and John. You're going to have to resist a force that was placed on this earth by Peter, James, and John that is against the gospel. It is no gospel at all. Paul called it another gospel, and then he says it's really no gospel whatsoever. So what they were teaching was not only not the gospel, and not only was it another gospel, Paul said this is not a gospel at all. There's no gospel in what these dudes are saying. And he rebuked them to the face in this same letter that we've got here, this same message to the Galatians. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty. The liberty. Now that just means to be set free, like a prisoner that's set free. Wherewith Christ hath made us free. If you've got a dictionary, a Strong's is fine, anyone will do. And be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. That Christ hath made us free. Now that term, made us free, means this. Listen to me carefully. This is what the Greek word means. It means to be made exempt from moral, mortal, ceremonial liability to God's law. What did Jesus make you free from? Jesus made you free from moral, ceremonial, and mortal liability to God's law. Now, by now, you ought to be jumping up and praising God and giving thanks and saying hallelujah and for the sermon, for the love of God that's been bestowed upon our lives. And thank God that you've got enough sense to sit down and look and see the difference between these teachers. It's vivid. This is not something vague. This is vivid in how that the works of Christianity has tried to mix and blend these teachings together. To me, is mind-boggling. It's craziness. He said, "And be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." You know, a yoke, as a yoke is, it's like oxen, and you put one thing over, two boards over the neck of two oxen, and that way that keeps them bound together, right? So here's what you got to do. Don't ever let that happen. Now, what is the yoke of bondage? The yoke of bondage is God's law as taught by Peter, James, and John. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you. What do you have to say, Paul? What do you have to say, dude? What do you got to say for yourself? Paul said, I say unto you, if you're circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. Whoa! Sorry, guys. Now, Paul isn't saying that everybody who is circumcised, that Christ will profit them nothing in these days. But you got to understand the context here. You see, they were claiming, Peter, James, and John were teaching that you had to be circumcised to be saved. Paul's saying if you did that to be saved, Christ profits you nothing. So not only has the image of Christ been destroyed out of you by the teachings of Peter, James, and John, but also there is no profit. There's no benefit to knowing Christ whatsoever. There is none anymore. That's why when people get saved, they've got this initial really wonderful, wonderful feeling, and it wears off really, really quick. All you got to do is go to church a few times. All you got to do is start hearing what your moral responsibility is, what your ceremonial responsibility is, what your mortal liability, let me say it right, liability. All you got to do is learn about what your moral liability is, what your ceremonial liability is, and your mortal liability is. The image of Christ gets erased, and the benefit of knowing Christ is gone. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised. Why was that such a big deal? He says, for I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Remember what Paul said? You that want to be back under the law, do you hear what the law says? Do you hear it? Do you hear it? Do you hear it? If you break one law, you broke them all. That's the context in which Paul is teaching this. And he says, Christ is become of no effect unto you. My goodness. Christ shall profit you nothing. And then what does he say? Christ is become of no effect unto you. Now, is it just about circumcision? Let's read on. Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by God's law, you have fallen from grace. If you claim anything that you're doing or not doing has substantiated, proven, validated that you are one with Christ, the benefit of your being one with Christ has been lost. The benefit, think of it, the benefit of you knowing Christ has been lost. You that are justified, not you that break God's law. People, I'm telling you, I sound crazy. I know, because I remember the first time I read this verse, and it's like it reverberates. It's like I was in shock. It's like that verse can't say that. And I read it over and over. I can't tell you how many times. And I keep going back just to make sure it's there. Christ has become of no effect to you. Every one of you that has any justification in God's law, I don't care what it is. If you're justified because you're not one of those, if you're justified because you are one of those, the image of Christ is gone out of you. Paul said it's going to take some work to get it back, but we can get it back. Stay tuned here. We'll get it back for you. We promise you, we will get it back for you. The image of Christ will reappear like it did that day you knew you were free. Like you did when you knew you were cleansed. We'll get it back for you. I know exactly how to get it back for you. You'll go around knowing the presence of Christ in you constantly. No waving and varying. Well, I feel holy today. I don't feel holy now. I was like, oh my gosh, I did this, said that. Oh, well, you know, who's going to win? Oh my gosh, it's 6:54, folks. What's 6:54, Michael? It's 6:54 here on the 2nd of June, 2019. That's how long it's been too long that this has been going on. It's exactly how long this has been going on, that much too long. And when the clock switches to 6:55, it'll be one more minute. It's gone on too long. Why am I intense? Why am I persuaded? Because time is something we don't all have. We're getting older. I hope the new generation, young generation coming up doesn't have to live in the bondage we've lived in. God forbid. But I can tell you there's as many legalistic young people that are just as willing to condemn anybody that doesn't toe the line. And they're all lying about what they're doing anyway and what they're not doing. Because Jesus said if you even think about it, you've done it. You who desire to be under the law, do you hear the law?